The Allied buildup for D-Day was unprecedented. There were massive airfields with thousands of aircraft, supply dumps containing millions of rounds of ammunition and enough vehicles to form a convoy stretching over 30 miles. But one element was even more crucial: an entire army designed to fool the Germans. Part 1 of our series, D-Day's Hidden War, the fake army that fooled Hitler. In the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing for the greatest military operation in history. But before the invasion could succeed, a war of shadows had to be fought. This was Operation Bodyguard, a deception so elaborate it reshaped the battlefield without firing a shot. It led Hitler and his generals to believe that the Allied assault would come at Calais, 200 miles away from Normandy, allowing D-Day to catch the Germans completely off guard. As Allied troops took their positions along the south coast of England, inflatable tanks lined the fields. At least 6 dummy airborne divisions were created, complete with fake supply dumps, inflatable tanks, and decoy artillery pieces. And, to top it all off, the British even went so far as to create inflatable zeppelins filled with gas to mimic the airships used by the British Royal Navy to blanket the skies over southern England. Their plan was to convince the Germans that Britain still possessed these massive blimps when in reality they had been grounded since 1914. These giant balloons floated above lifelike villages built of wood and canvas, each with fake street signs pointing to non-existent businesses. Some of the decoy settlements even featured life-sized wooden houses with mannequins sitting on their porches. Throughout southern England, decoys were available for every season. Summer homes were turned into fake farms with livestock made of cloth. Others were dressed as bombed-out shell holes filled with sandbags. Wooden aircraft stood ready on fake airstrips, and entire radio networks transmitted phantom orders. At the center of the ruse was General George S. Patton, a legend in German eyes, chosen to command a ghost army that never intended to fight. The idea for a dummy army came from an unlikely source: British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On December 1943, he told his cabinet that if the Allied invasion came anywhere in the West, the Germans would surely know about it because of the sheer size of the invasion force required. A few weeks later, British intelligence officers met with American generals to flesh out the plan. Initially, the Americans were skeptical, believing the risk was too great. But after some convincing, they agreed to participate. Churchill gave the operation the name Bodyguard and placed Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks in charge. The plan called for inflatable tanks and other decoys to be scattered around the southeast coast of England, with the goal of creating a phantom army group of 21st Army Group, a fake headquarters building and command network, inflatable zeppelins, decoy artillery, dummy airfields, and even bogus pillboxes manned by civilians. Hitler's generals would see the buildup of this fake army and assume that this was where the Allied landing would take place. This would allow the real invasion force to sneak past German defenses in Normandy undetected. But the Allied generals weren't just trying to fool Hitler, they also wanted to keep their actual plans secret from the British public. If word got out that the British were planning an invasion of Europe, people might try to interfere, either out of fear that their country would be invaded or because they didn't want war. So the deception had 2 layers: one to trick the Germans and the other to keep the British in the dark. Hitler was known to second-guess himself. Even when his generals assured him that there was no planned Allied invasion coming, he worried that they were lying to him and refused to believe them. He knew that an Allied invasion was coming, but he couldn't imagine that they would attempt such a bold move so close to France's heavily fortified defenses along the coast. His mind could not wrap its head around the fact that the Allied forces would dare to invade at Normandy, much less attempt to storm the beaches and cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. For him, the only logical place for an attack to come was from the relatively undefended coast of northern France. So, in early May, Hitler moved the crack units of his army hundreds of miles from Normandy to the Calais region. By mid-June, 80% of Germany's armored vehicles and half of its total army were stationed between Le Havre and the Belgian border. Even the Luftwaffe was ordered to move to the north to intercept the coming Allied attack. All the while, Allied troops continued to gather in southern England, boarding ships and planes in near total silence. The invasion was set. Operation Bodyguard was a war of shadows, meaning that nobody involved was supposed to talk about it. Anyone who learned about the deception was sworn to secrecy until the Allied victory was assured. The plan was too dangerous to risk being exposed prematurely. One of the most important parts of Operation Bodyguard was fooling the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The Allied air forces under the command of Trafford Lee Mallory needed to convince the Germans that the real invasion force was in the southeast. To do this, they created dummy airfields and painted fake invasion stripes on the wings of aircraft. They also painted fake invasion stripes on the wings of aircraft. They also conducted practice bombing runs over decoy sites and programmed the aircraft to make certain flight paths to further convince the Germans that the real Allied Air Force was positioned in Kent and Sussex. It wasn't just the Allied aircraft that needed to be accounted for. The British also needed to deal with the civilian air traffic in the area. Mallory knew that if the Germans saw civilian planes flying in and out of the fake airfields, they would suspect something was up. So he worked with the British Air Ministry to reroute civilian flights away from the dummy airfields. This meant that for several weeks, people living in southern England couldn't fly in or out of their local airports. It was a huge inconvenience, but people were too afraid to question the military. After all, it was wartime and anything could happen. There was even a special unit tasked with shooting down any German reconnaissance aircraft that dared enter British airspace. If the Germans managed to shoot down an Allied plane, they might find coded messages that revealed the location of the real invasion force. But if they managed to shoot down one of the decoy planes, they would only find mundane things like pilots' licenses and maps of the area. To make matters even more confusing, the Allies intentionally broadcast false radio signals to mislead German intelligence. One of the biggest risks of the operation was that the Germans might capture an Allied soldier and use him to obtain information about the invasion. So the British military police were given the power to execute any captured Allied soldier who knew too much about the invasion, without giving them a trial. Meanwhile, General Patton was hard at work creating his Phantom Army Group. He assembled 5 armored divisions, 9 infantry divisions, 3 airborne divisions, and numerous support units. Of course, none of these units actually existed. What did exist were inflatable tanks, trucks, jeeps, guns, ammunition dumps, warehouses, even buildings. The British even went so far as to create a fake radio network that transmitted orders from non-existent commanders. On June 5, 1944, a German reconnaissance plane flew over the fake army group and sent back photos to Berlin. The following day, German intelligence analysts distributed the photos with a memo saying, "If the English are serious about this, we will have to move troops from Normandy to the Pas-de-Calais." By now, German leaders believed that the real Allied invasion force was in southern England. Even Hitler's wife, Eva Braun, wrote in her diary that she believed the attack would come from the southeast. By June, Operation Bodyguard was in full swing. The Germans were totally convinced that the real invasion force was in southern England. So, when Allied troops began landing in Normandy, the German High Command assumed that it was a diversionary attack. As Allied troops took the beaches, German commanders argued about whether they should send reinforcements to Normandy or hold their positions and wait for the attack to fail. Meanwhile, Allied troops struggled to gain a foothold on the beach. But thanks to the deception, no German reinforcements came. When the dust finally settled on D-Day, the Allies had suffered heavy casualties, but they had managed to establish a beachhead in France. It was a small one, barely a mile wide, but it was enough. Over the next few days, Allied troops brought in supplies and equipment and prepared to launch their next assault. Once again, the Germans were fooled. They didn't realize that the real Allied invasion force was right under their noses. Had it not been for Operation Bodyguard, the beaches might have become a graveyard for history's greatest gamble. As the clock struck midnight on June 6, 1944, before the waves of infantry ever touched the sand, the first blows of D-Day were struck from the sky. Thousands of American and British paratroopers leapt into the darkness above Normandy. They carried rifles, maps, and the fate of the invasion. The night was chaos. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through the skies, scattering the C-47 transport planes. Many soldiers landed miles from their objectives, trapped in flooded fields, or hanging from trees. Entire units were shattered before they ever fired a shot. Yet from this confusion emerged moments of extraordinary courage. Small groups of men captured bridges, cut phone lines, and delayed German reinforcements. In Stemer-Église, a paratrooper named John Steele became tangled on the church steeple, forced to play dead as the battle raged below. The paratroopers' mission was to sow chaos, and chaos became their greatest weapon. Though scattered and broken, their presence forced the Germans to hesitate, buying the precious hours needed for the beach landings to begin. Without these men who dropped into the fire, the invasion might have collapsed before dawn. This is D-Day Midnight, the paratroopers' impossible mission. June 1944 dawned gray and overcast. Flying back from a mission over France, American bomber crews watched Allied fighters escorting gliders and transport planes streak across the pre-dawn sky towards the coast of Normandy. But there were no transport planes for Private First Class Joseph Lanzalotta of the 101st Airborne Division. He gripped the side of his Waco glider, knuckles white against the worn fabric, as it bucked and swayed in the turbulent air currents above enemy territory. Below him, thick black smoke blotted out the moonlight. Then, suddenly, with a sickening jolt, the glider lurched downward, its wooden frame creaking in protest as it hit the ground hard. Dazed but unharmed, Lanzalotta scrambled out of the wreckage and stumbled into the darkness. What the hell just happened? He asked himself aloud. He had meant to land in a thick copse of trees near a bridge. Instead, his glider had crashed in an open field, its crumpled remains silhouetted against the glow of flames rising in the distance. For Joseph and thousands of other Allied paratroopers, the nightmare of D-Day began long before the sun rose over the beaches of Normandy. Because, as the Allies planned, Operation Neptune, the airborne landings that preceded the coming assault on the beaches were scheduled for the dead of night. It was a bold plan, one fraught with risk. But Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force Dwight D. Eisenhower hoped it would allow Allied troops to seize key positions behind enemy lines before the Germans realized what was happening. By 11:30 p.m. on June 5th, most of the paratroopers were aboard their transport planes. The massive armada of Allied shipping was still several miles off the French coast, but high above the channel the paratroopers sat tense and silent in the dark, gripping their rifles, listening to the drone of the engines. Soon, they knew, they would need those weapons. As the gliders approached their drop zones, some of the paratroopers climbed out of the cargo holds to help guide the pilots. But by now, anti-aircraft fire was ripping through the darkness, shattering transport planes like glass. Some gliders crashed in the fields, others burst into flames as flak tore through their wooden frames. And all around the Allied paratroopers fell, tumbling through the air with only a parachute to break their fall. Private Richard Dingaman of the 82nd Airborne had just climbed out of his transport plane when the fuselage exploded in a ball of flame. Trapped by the wind snatching at his parachute, he found himself swinging helplessly through the air. Fighting to free himself from the rigging, Dingaman tumbled end over end, finally landing hard in a tree. Bruised but unharmed, he looked up to see the glider that had brought him here crash into the trees and burst into flames. Shards of wood and equipment rained down around him as he raced toward the sound of gunfire and the shouts of his comrades. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Allied warships were approaching their final battle stations. The transport planes carrying the rest of the Allied troops were still several hours away, but General Leonard T. Jarrow, commander of the 82nd Airborne, knew that if his men could hold out for just a few more hours, everything would be all right. He just had to keep them alive until dawn. But even as the ships closed in on the beaches, many of the paratroopers had yet to find solid ground. Lieutenant William R. Walker of the 101st Airborne watched anxiously as one of his men tumbled through the air, his chute dragging him toward a patch of trees. With a final jerk, the man came to a stop, hanging by his chute, suspended between a tree and a life. But as Walker ran toward him, he saw the man's face drain of color and his grip on the rigging slacken. His helmet slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground, bouncing once before resting beside a shallow grave already dug by the falling paratrooper's comrades. Walker hurried forward, dropping to his knees beside the grave. Within minutes, the paratrooper was dead. Even as Allied troops took heavy casualties, some managed to seize key bridges and road junctions, cutting off reinforcements and supplies to German forces in the area. But as the Allied fighters screamed overhead, many of the paratroopers remained trapped in flooded fields, hanging from trees or lying wounded in the tall grass, completely at the mercy of the elements and the Germans who stalked among them. Near the town of Église, paratrooper John Steele clung to the steeple of the town church, desperately trying to free himself from the silken ropes of his parachute. Below him, the streets bustled with German soldiers and vehicles. One of Steele's comrades wandered into the square, spotted the crumpled form in the tower, and shouted a warning. "Don't shoot," Steele begged the Germans. "I am unarmed." But his pleas went unheard. The Germans opened fire, forcing him to scramble back to the relative safety of the roof. Coughing up blood, Steele began to climb down the steeple. He crept along the eaves, hiding from the sporadic bursts of gunfire, until he reached a drainpipe. Slithering down the cold metal, Steele made his way to the ground, collapsing into the tall grass, hoping the Germans wouldn't notice the slight rise in the foliage. Steele wasn't the only paratrooper forced to make a desperate bid for survival. From Utah Beach to Église, paratroopers hid in haylofts, barns, and cellars, waiting for the Germans to pass and praying they wouldn't be discovered. Some paratroopers who landed near water waded into the shallows, stripping off their heavy equipment and camouflaging themselves with mud and foliage. When the Germans came searching, they found only a handful of abandoned rifles and helmets. Others, still clinging to their guns, fought back, picking off the Germans from the safety of the tall grass. Back in England, war correspondent and author Ernie Pyle watched the Allied armada set sail for the beaches of Normandy. On the ship that carried him, Pyle wrote about the paratroopers whose fate was now tied to the success of the invasion. They are boys and young men, mostly boys, who go tonight to fight the battles which will open up the long-awaited front in Western Europe. For the most part, they are green, raw farm boys and city toughs, shop boys and students, clerks and factory hands. They have been thrown together from hundreds of towns and cities. Now they are a unit, and in hours they will take their place among the immortals of D-Day. We can't win the war without them, and we can't do it without their chutzpah. They are our underdogs and our hope. They are our boys, and though they are scared, they're going ahead. The Allied troops had managed to hold out through the night, but now the Germans were closing in, driving toward the beaches in armored vehicles and tanks. Soon they would collide with the Allied troops who had landed farther west. As they raced toward the beaches, the paratroopers clinging to the rail of a bridge watched in horror as a pair of German tanks rumbled past, followed by a column of trucks carrying fresh German reinforcements. Unable to stop the vehicles with their rifles, the paratroopers pulled back, firing at the fleeing Germans and racing toward the beaches. As the sun rose over Normandy, paratrooper Donald Hall watched a lone German soldier stumble out of the trees, raise his hands, and surrender. Beside him, another paratrooper shook his head. "There goes my chance for some action," he said wearily. Hall smiled, thinking about the hours he'd spent huddled in a ditch with his rifle, listening to the Germans hunting him and his comrades. "Sure, you'll get your chance," he said. "It's only 6 in the morning. The day's still young." But as the hours passed and the fighting intensified, Hall realized that the real battle was only just beginning. By 11:30 a.m., Allied troops had landed on the beaches, but on Utah and Omaha beaches, the fighting was brutal and costly. German artillery pounded the troops, forcing them to take cover in the shallows or race toward the cliffs above the beach. Still, by early afternoon, The troops had pushed inland, securing a foothold on the beaches. Meanwhile, back in England, the people celebrated VE Day, convinced that the war in Europe was over. But for the paratroopers scattered across the hills and hedgerows of Normandy, the fighting had only just begun. Thanks to their sacrifice, the Allied armies would eventually take the beaches, opening a new front in the war that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe and the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. On D-Day, nearly 1,400 paratroopers were killed, 5,500 wounded. Many more were missing in action. But in the days that followed, those who survived the beaches of Normandy would rejoin the Allied armies, fighting across Europe until Nazi Germany fell. At dawn, June 6, 1944, the gates of the landing craft dropped and Omaha Beach erupted into fire. German machine guns swept the sand, cutting down men before they even touched the shore. The woves turned red as bodies floated beside sinking equipment. Soldiers struggled through water weighed down by packs and weapons, only to collapse under relentless fire. Engineers raced out, desperately racing to clear obstacles, only to be gunned down in minutes. Commanders considered withdrawal, but fragments of units pressed forward, crawling through smoke and shrapnel, stumbling over the dead. It was survival, not strategy. As one young soldier wrote later, "I died on Omaha Beach that day, but somehow I kept moving." The human cost was staggering. Within hours, thousands were dead or wounded, many more missing. Yet against all odds, the Americans secured the beach. They pushed inland, silencing one pillbox after another until by afternoon, Omaha was theirs, though littered with the fallen. Omaha Beach was hell on earth, but it was also the crucible where victory was forged. And though this story has been told and retold, there are still secrets to discover, experiences to relive, and lessons to learn. On that fateful morning, Allied soldiers waited anxiously in their landing craft, packed tightly like sardines and filled with explosives. When the order came to charge, many prayed. Some made last-minute confessions. One man later recalled, "I remember thinking that when we hit the beach, if I get killed, that'll be the end of Joseph P. Riley." But death wasn't immediate for most. The landing craft approached the shore, then slowed, idling just offshore. This lull gave some men time to appreciate the danger ahead. The swells rocking the boat suddenly seemed menacing, each wave threatening to capsize them and dump them into the churning water. Men looked at each other, unsure what to say, unsure of anything except that they were about to face something terrible. Soon enough, the suspense ended. The ramp dropped and they charged into the abyss. The first wave hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., followed by 3 more in quick succession. Each carried hundreds of men, all armed to the teeth and all destined for the same fate. For though Omaha Beach had been designated the bloodiest of the 5 invasion beaches, its fate was decided in the first few minutes. As the first landing craft approached the shore, German defenders opened fire, mowing down men even before they reached the sand. In the water, others fell victim to the so-called green hell, a reference to the thick seaweed and underwater obstacles that tore at exposed flesh. Still others got caught on the beach, unable to advance and trapped by the rising tide. Trapped in a narrow corridor between the sea and the cliffs, they became sitting ducks for German guns. In minutes, the landing craft were either destroyed or pulled back, leaving the men stranded. Soon, the beach became a scene of indescribable carnage. Men burned to death inside armored vehicles. Others drowned, pulling themselves toward the shore. Medical aid stations quickly overwhelmed. Corpses littered the landscape. All along the beach, troops battled to dig their feet into the shifting sand. On a day like any other summer day in Normandy, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying away the smoke of battle and depositing it on the Allied lines. Coughing, choking, and disoriented, the men struggled to find their bearings. As one soldier said later, "We couldn't see a thing. We couldn't hear a thing. We were lost in a brown fog of smoke, and I didn't know whether I was walking or running." Amidst the din, men fought to stay alive. Wounded soldiers stumbled around, oblivious to their injuries, desperate for water. Others, overcome with nausea, collapsed to their knees. One officer remembered seeing a medic trying to revive a young private. The medic worked over him for about 20 minutes, but the kid was gone. He was dead. The medic finally sat down on a nearby tank and put his head in his hands and moaned, "What's the use? What's the use?" And yet amidst this hellish tableau, pockets of resistance held out. Pockets of resistance held out. An assault group led by Lieutenant Alex Pencholi led a desperate charge inland, fighting door to door and house to house. Their mission, to take out as many pillboxes as possible. Another group of American paratroopers advanced through Beevor, holding off a German counterattack and securing the village for good. Other troops followed, battling through the dense underbrush and taking heavy losses along the way. Throughout the day, casualties mounted. Soldiers fell victim to enemy fire, to friendly fire, to medical mistakes. Many died from wounds that might have healed given time, but there was no time on Omaha Beach. The fight was desperate and immediate. Though the bulk of casualties occurred during the initial landings, soldiers who survived the beach still faced a perilous journey home. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles and dead bodies. Survivors risked everything to scavenge what they could, often coming under fire from hidden snipers. As evening approached, the full extent of the carnage became clear. Of the nearly 35,000 Allied troops who landed on Omaha Beach, more than 2,500 were dead. More than 5,000 wounded soldiers crowded the aid stations, many without food or water. Along the shore, thousands more lay dead or dying, some still clutching their rifles, others forever frozen in a silent scream. Among them was 19-year-old Donald Deming, whose letter home ended abruptly. "I just got landed, and things are really happening now. Please pray that I may live to see you again. Love, Donald." Though victory was theirs, the beach remained a scene of unspeakable horror. Amidst the carnage, heroic stories emerged. Private First Class George W. Taylor, Jr., distinguished himself by his acts of valor. Assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, Taylor repeatedly put himself in harm's way to rescue his comrades. Once he dove on a grenade, shielding fellow soldiers and sacrificing himself. Taylor received the Medal of Honor for his actions, becoming one of 27 recipients of the nation's highest military honor for his actions on Omaha Beach. Dr. Henry J. Suchman, a member of the 47th Medical Battalion, epitomized courage and resilience. Working tirelessly amidst heavy fire, he saved countless lives. When ammunition ran low, he used his bare hands to dig anti-tank obstacles, demonstrating remarkable tenacity. Sucham's bravery and resourcefulness became a beacon of hope on a day when hope seemed lost. Sergeant William J. O'Brien of the 16th Infantry Regiment exemplified leadership and determination. Facing overwhelming odds, he rallied his troops, reorganized the lines, and led assaults on enemy positions. Despite being wounded multiple times, O'Brien refused medical treatment, choosing instead to remain with his men, inspiring them to fight. His unwavering commitment played a crucial role in securing the beachhead, ensuring the success of the larger invasion. But perhaps the most enduring image of Omaha Beach came not from the chaos of battle, but from a lone figure silhouetted against the smoke and fire. As Allied soldiers fought to secure the beach, one man stood out: Major Howard B. Buck, a member of the 11th Engineers. Battling heavy fire, he moved from position to position, rallying troops and directing operations. When a medic suggested he seek cover, Buck replied, "I don't give a damn what happens to me. Go help those others." And he returned to the fight until he was killed. Later, a Life magazine photographer captured a haunting image of Buck kneeling beside a foxhole, forever immortalizing his courage and sacrifice. After 4 long days of fighting, the Allied forces emerged victorious, securing their foothold in Western Europe. But the cost of victory was staggering. The scars of Omaha Beach ran deep, both physically and emotionally. Thousands of lives were lost or forever altered. Homes were destroyed, futures shattered. Yet amidst the devastation, the human spirit prevailed. Stories of heroism, courage, and selflessness emerged, reminding us of our shared humanity and the bonds that unite us in the face of adversity. The story of Omaha Beach is a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. It's a story of courage and sacrifice, of loss and remembrance. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, let us honor the fallen and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. By afternoon, the beaches of Normandy were secured. At Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, Allied troops pushed inland with fewer losses than Omaha. But resistance was still fierce. The French resistance rose, cutting rail lines and ambushing German convoys. In Berlin, Hitler refused to release reserves, convinced the real attack would come at Calais. His hesitation was fatal. Within days, the Allies built floating harbors, unloaded thousands of vehicles, and began pouring across France. The German war machine could not recover. D-Day was not the end of the war, but it was the end of Hitler's chances to win. Europe's fate was sealed on those beaches. For the men who fought, the memories never faded. For history, June 6th became the day the world turned. I'm the host, and today on this channel, let's look at D-Day, the day Hitler lost the war. It is June 6, 1943. Aboard the Musashi, Japanese Admiral Mikawa has just learned that his fleet has destroyed 4 American aircraft carriers. The U.S. will eventually get its revenge at Midway, but today is not that day. And for the Allies, victory in one theater of war means little when their other fronts are stalled or going badly. In the East, Germany's allies are crumbling. Finland has sued for peace. Italy is on the verge of surrender, but Hitler refuses to accept it. He is waiting for something that never comes. As the war enters its 4th year, hopes of a quick German victory have long since faded. Victory now seems a distant dream. In Britain, the politicians know they face a long struggle ahead. Winston Churchill asks his new Prime Minister, William L.J. Mackenzie King, if Canada can send more troops. Mackenzie King replies, "We have already sent all we have." In Moscow, Stalin has just marked the anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union by launching a furious counterattack. After 2 years of steady retreat, the Red Army is pushing the Germans back. Even so, the Soviets also know the war will go on for years. But across the Channel, a different mood prevails. Adolf Hitler is convinced the Allies are about to launch a major offensive, but he doesn't believe it will be in Normandy. The defenses along the coast are weak. There are only a few anti-tank guns, and most of the heavy weapons have been moved elsewhere. On June, Hitler even tells his generals, an invasion from this quarter is out of the question. So why then does he think the Allied invasion will fail? Because he knows the British well. They have always preferred to attack at Calais. This is the shortest route to Berlin. Why waste time marching through France? Surely the British will try to capture Paris and race across the Seine. So, while the Allied armies prepare for battle, Hitler keeps his best troops in reserve. He also decides to surprise the British by attacking them first. In Moscow, Stalin hears rumors of a coming Allied invasion. At first, he is skeptical. But when Hitler declares war on the Soviet Union, Stalin realizes the danger is real. He immediately calls off the summer offensive. Millions of men dig in, preparing to defend their hard-won gains. At 2:50 a.m., Allied paratroops land in 3 areas, code-named Utah, Juno, and Sword. On the far left flank, the British 3rd Division lands on what will become known as Sword Beach. Here, Lieutenant General John Crocker leads 5 infantry brigades and a few artillery battalions. Their mission is to push inland toward the town of Beevor. On the center, the Canadian 3rd Division lands on Juno. Major General Charles Oakes commands 3 infantry brigades and a few artillery battalions. They will advance south toward the village of Carpiquet. On the right flank, the American 1st and 29th Divisions land on Utah and Omaha Beach. Lieutenant General Lewis B. Puller commands 7 infantry brigades and 17 artillery battalions. They will march inland toward the town of St. Malo. As Allied troops take the beaches, other units secure the flanks. In the air, hundreds of Allied fighters and bombers engage the Luftwaffe. For 2 days they have been softening up German defenses, but nothing can fully prepare these men for what lies ahead. The Allied troops suffer staggering casualties. The Americans are stopped in their tracks by German machine guns. The British and Canadians inch forward, taking heavy losses. By evening, the beaches are secured, but the cost is beyond measure. At Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, Allied troops push inland with fewer losses than Omaha. But resistance is still fierce. Hitler is wrong. The main Allied attack is in Normandy. But in many ways, this is good news. The Germans have a strong defensive line, but once the Allies breach it, the country will be wide open. If the British can advance quickly, they may reach Paris before the Germans can move reserves from the east. Back in Britain, King George VI broadcasts to his people. He tells them the landings have succeeded, and the Allies are fighting alongside brave allies on the continent. We shall not rest, and we shall not sleep until this is won. But back in Normandy, there is little cause for celebration. The fighting has taken a heavy toll, but the worst is yet to come. The Allies will need supplies, lots of supplies, and they're bringing most of those supplies into a war zone across an unsecured coastline. German U-boats lie in wait, ready to disrupt Allied shipping. Coastal defenses can still mount a strong defense. The Allied armies are spread too thin to protect themselves. The United States and Britain have nowhere near enough troops. On June, a massive Allied convoy begins arriving off the coast of Normandy. Transport ships drop anchor in the shallow waters off the beaches. Men in lifeboats row out to the vessels, ferrying troops and equipment ashore. The Allies have brought over 100,000 men into Normandy, but only about 23,000 are combat troops. Of those, only a third are hard-pressed infantry. The rest are support staff, engineers, and artillery crews. The Allied landings have succeeded, but it's touch and go whether they can hold on. For 4 nights, Allied troops hold out, living on rations and ammunition, battling the elements and mounting constant attacks against the Germans. All the while, Allied engineers work around the clock to bring in more supplies. Flying back to Britain, Churchill tells Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, "We must unload everything that is coming our way." But how? The Allies are dependent on a tiny window of opportunity. The Germans could launch a major counterattack at any moment. Heavy seas threaten to swamp the landing craft. Storms lash the coastline. If the Allies lose control of the beaches, the entire invasion force could be wiped out. On June, something remarkable happens. The storms abate and the skies clear. For 3 glorious days the Allies load in supplies and reinforcements. Every Allied soldier receives orders to fight to the death. The Allied armies will not retreat. Within days, 850 ships arrive, unloading 27,000 vehicles, including 4,000 tanks. Wounded soldiers are evacuated and fresh troops come ashore. The Allies are fully committed to the invasion. Hitler's chance to stop them has passed. Within hours, Allied armor is rolling inland. The race for Paris is on. The Germans will never recapture the initiative. They remain a deadly fighting force, but without reserves, they cannot stop the Allied advance. Hitler has lost the war. From the air, Allied fighter escorts protect bombing runs and transport planes. As Allied armor overruns German defenses, supply trucks rush forward, keeping the tanks fueled and fed. Soon, entire industrial centers are rolling across France, manufacturing replacement tanks as fast as the Germans can destroy them. The Allies are fighting a war of movement. Meanwhile, in southern France, the Italian campaign is reaching its climax. From their mountain strongholds, German forces launch a last stand. But the end is inevitable. On September 3, 1943, the Germans capitulate in northern Italy. With the Italian front collapsing, Hitler turns his attention to Greece and Yugoslavia. But this, too, ends in disaster. On October 8, 1943, the Germans surrender in Greece. On May 8, 1945, the Germans surrender again, this time in Italy. In the east, the Red Army has smashed the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets push west. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, millions of Germans surrender to the Soviets. And in the Pacific, the tide has also turned. By late 1943, Japan's allies have all surrendered. Facing inevitable defeat, the Japanese emperor accepts the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrenders. The war is over. On those beaches long ago, men fought and died who never saw the end of the war. For many, the memories never faded. For history, June 6th became the day the world turned.